We hold these truths speaks out. Tonight we're going to be talking about an interesting video that we happened to come upon, and to get an analysis of this, we're going to have Chuck Carlson, the founder of We Hold These Truths, and Craig Hansen talk to us about that. Chuck?
Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's Chuck Carlson speaking. We ask you a question. Do you trust the media, and which ones do you trust? Tonight we're going to look at a few media sources, two I believe in fact, and their value in finding the truth, and also at the distortions that come from them. How do we sort out the truth in this controlled media world? To do this, we must figure out whose message each media source is selling. In my freshman year in college, a teacher, speech teacher, I only took the course because I had to, he told me that there were three parts to every presentation, including a speech. One, tell them what you're about to tell them. Two, tell them. And then three, tell them what you just told them. My teacher wouldn't have liked most stories we were reading today. He would say that the writers usually do not make it clear what they are saying and why they are saying it. This fits most of our press today. When it comes to issues like what we're going to be talking about, the Israelis and what they're doing to the Palestinian Arab citizens in Gaza, getting a straight answer is incredibly difficult. The big reason for this lack of candidness is money. We as readers have to take into consideration who funds the guys who are reading or who we are hearing. What is the money point of view of every writer? This is why we must find an independent media. We never mind the question of competence. The question of independence has to come first. We Hold These Truths is trying to sell you, the listener, our point of view. We strive to express our defined purpose in everything we say and do. We do not represent any financial interest that we know of. However, we welcome any gifts that you might send our way. The problem with this technique that my speech teacher taught, the tell them approach, is that a lot of people will not agree with us because of what they have been taught by others. In our case, others often include their churches or Bible study leaders. Our audience is going to be a lot smaller than if we used more charm and less facts in what we do. That's why We Hold These Truths is dependent upon others among the media to carry our message. Even if they don't hold our flag, we must learn who we can trust, and so each of you listeners are asked to trust us. Tonight we're discussing two or three seemingly well-funded, successful media sources, and we're going to treat the question of credibility. One of our earlier knowledge breakthroughs was about Israel and Palestine. We found out the former was systematically killing and standing, and we found out that the former was systematically killing and starving the Palestinians. We figured out why our major media and many of our churches supported the aggressor, the Israeli aggressors. And we have also learned why our president and most of the press, as well as most of the Congress, support the aggressors, who just happen to have only rocks. The victims have only rocks to throw and burning kites with which to fight back. All of that, and the aggressors, of course, have all the deadly weapons they need. Christian Zionism is a related case at point. We first learned about it 19 years ago by seeing the killing from the victim side in Gaza. This was thanks to a providential trip to which we were in Gaza, and there was no denying it. We saw it. We saw it firsthand, because we did not then know anyone who would believe our knowledge, our story. We started out by doing volunteer vigils and pickets in front of churches that we knew to be putting across the idea we came to call Christian Zionism. We confronted those with whom we are most likely to disagree. Christian Zionism is a mighty supporter of Israel's genocide against the people of Gaza and its parent Palestinians. Today, the vacuum of knowledge is largely gone. A lot of the media sources are talking about Christian Zionism, and some are covering it up by thwarting it and thwarting its exposure. Some of the truth seekers got the idea that got this information largely from us, but also from others. But other interested parties would like to put exposure of the Christian Zionists 6 feet underground. So our task today is to unwind the truth from fiction, and the truth tellers from the liars. That brings us to our first subject of tonight. A highly successful young Republican called simply VOX, publication called VOX. It is a modern written source that discusses this systematic annihilation in Israel. We ask, where does VOX really stand? Where is its support financially coming from? And can we rely on it as a news service? The title of the piece that Craig Hansen will now review in detail is How a Bible Prophecy Shapes Trump's Foreign Policy. This was the title of the piece by VOX. Craig Hansen will discuss this, and he will analyze the VOX publication to see if they are telling us anything we know or don't know. In other words, which side are they on? The exposure side or the cover-up side, or both, and why? Craig Hansen is a Bible scholar. He has led vigils and pickets outside of Zionist churches that were covering for Israel. And Craig is going to review the recent story from Vox, How a Bible Prophecy Shapes Trump, that's President Trump's, foreign policy. Craig?
Great, Chuck. Well, thank you for that intro. It was really interesting to see this piece by Vox. Thank you for pointing me in that direction. It's really great to see Christian Zionism being exposed on a broad basis. I just checked; they're already over 1 million views on this YouTube piece, and definitely would like to encourage any of our listeners and watchers to click on that and check it out for themselves. So the fact that it's getting that much coverage, I think, is a real positive. And what we're going to talk about in the next few minutes is that, yes, it's really good. It can't do it all because it's just it's less than 8 minutes. So I'm just going to talk about some of the points. So again, in only 8 minutes, you can't give everything, all the history of Christian Zionism, how it came to be, the history of the Zionism on the Jewish side, Palestine. I mean, there's so much you obviously can't cover that in 8 minutes. But definitely they've primed the pump. When I first heard the phrase Christian Zionism, I knew it was brand new to me, and that's where I just did the Google search on Christian Zionism, and lo and behold, We Hold These Truths showed up, and I made contact with you, Chuck, and like they say, the rest is history. And that's been, I don't know how many, 6 years ago, something like that now. And it's been a learning experience all the way along. So I want to say, since I started on this journey with you, Chuck, I think I've amassed over maybe 8 to 10 feet of books about Christian Zionism and all that. And for what we're talking tonight is how a Bible prophecy shapes Trump's foreign policy. Well, one of the best books on that one is right here, and it has nothing to do with religion at all, but it has to do with how the Israeli lobby shapes foreign policy in the United States. That one's really good. Another one here that I really enjoy, Against Our Better Judgment by Alison Weir. She points out how there was a lot of effort not to support the nation state of Israel back in the 40s and so forth, but how manipulation, again, like you said, follow the money, how the money manipulates the votes and so forth. And then this is one that came out of We Hold These Truths, several years ago, One Nation under Israel. That's a good one. But what we're going to be talking about is how the Christians why they support Israel in the way they do. So I'm going to touch on some of those ideas. The phrases that were put out in the video talked about evangelical Christians. That phrase. Also, a literal interpretation of the Bible, Jewish ancestral homeland, and the British Mandate. These are phrases that are thrown out without a whole lot of definition, and that's to me where the danger lies. Again, in 8 minutes, you can't go into all this, so we're kind of expanding some of those things. But let's look at the phrase evangelical Christian. What does that mean? And how is it, if you just watched this video and knew nothing else about what an evangelical Christian was or is, you think they're a bunch of wackos who are just doing all these crazy things, and it looks really bad. But if you kind of take that apart, evangelical Christian, I go, if by that moniker, evangelical Christian is a person who believes the Bible is the inspired word of God, that Jesus really did live, that he did miracles, that he was sentenced to death by the Jews and crucified by the Romans, that Jesus rose from the dead on the third day, defeating sin and death, and that he is alive today in the presence of God the Father, and he wants all people to come to that faith and that relationship with him so they can have a personal relationship with the God of creation. Then, I say amen to that. That is really, that's who I am. But I have to say a really big, however, I am now a Christian Zionist. And to lump evangelicals into the Christian Zionist camp, I think is a very powerful weakness in this Vox video, because they take evangelical Christians and just make them all Zionists, and that's what you're going to come away with. And I think that's definitely wrong, because Chuck, you, me, and all of us here at We Hold These Truths, we've come out of a Christian Zionism teaching, upbringing, because it is fairly widespread in the church. One phrase that they used, it says, the center of a decades-long conflict. And most recently, there's a third group becoming more influential in the Middle East, evangelical Christians. Well, what that article, the video fails to really mention is that actually Christian Zionism predates Jewish Zionism, and this goes back to the 1800s. This is not something that just showed up on the radar when Trump got elected. This is something that's been going on for over 150 years to almost now. But the blame and the guilt, the way I see it, for all the suffering that has taken place in the Holy Land, and it can be, and I really believe should be, laid at the feet of Christian Zionists, and who may or may not be evangelicals. You have people that are Zionists that are not evangelicals, and they support that line. A lot of politicians, they wouldn't consider themselves evangelicals, but they're definitely Zionists when it comes to it. One thing I like to do when any kind of thought comes up is follow the thread. Start pulling on this thread and see where it leads. In the video, a lot of airtime was given to Pastor Greg Laurie. He's a featured Christian Zionist megachurch pastor, and he's in the Vox video. He's a protege of the Calvary Chapel founder Chuck Smith, who was ordained in the Foursquare Gospel Church, which is an evangelical Pentecostal Christian denomination founded in 1923 by preacher Amy Semple McPherson. And her husband was an Irish Pentecostal minister. Now we're getting back into the 1900s, about the same time the Schofield Reference Bible came out, and in this, the whole theology that's behind this, it's called dispensationalism, or more in apropos to this is premillennial dispensationalism. And the biggest proponents of that are all the Pentecostal denominations and all the different flavors of Baptists. So those two big groups have taken this premillennial dispensationism and brought that in. One of the key things of that is that God has a two separate tracks, one for the Jews and one for the church, that they kind of run parallel. God's physical people are the Jews, the spiritual people are the church. And it's really some messed up stuff that really came into Christianity in the late 1800s. This is not something that's historic Christianity. So when they put the little banner at the video showing that a lot of Christians, the mainline, like Catholics and so forth, don't buy into this. Well, that's because it's not historical. It didn't come into the church until, like I said, until the late 1800s. I thought it very interesting too that Vox chose to select this Sarah Posner, and she's a left-leaning Jewish journalist, to tell the audience who evangelical Christians are. You know, I thought that was a little crazy. And again, she doesn't really get into why these evangelicals, why they believe what they believe and where it comes from. So anyway, again, just a nutshell to hopefully get the information out that people will start doing their research on their own. Again, start with our website. We hold these truths. Look at our documentary, Christian Zionism, The Tragedy and the Turning, Part 1. That's a great place to start. You go on YouTube, Steven Sizer. He's got great stuff. One of his roadmap to Armageddon and Zionist Christian soldiers, because the way this whole thing goes is, I have to say, when you see Mike Pence and Pompeo talking about these are people that want war. Well, this is definitely going to create war the way we're going, and the fact that these people claim to be Christians who supposedly worship the Prince of Peace, the actions don't match the teaching. And that's our biggest complaint with the Christian Zionism, at least from my standpoint, is it doesn't represent Jesus. You can't look at Christian Zionism and see, oh, this is something what Jesus would do. Yeah, he'd bulldoze your olive orchards down. He'd flatten your houses. He'd steal your property and say, yes, peace be unto you. No, this is not Jesus. It's not God. And you have to go back to the roots of all this. It's not Christian. To me, it's a cult, that it doesn't represent who Jesus is. If you want to, Zionism is its own thing. And I know some people don't even put Christian Zionism together. They say, how can you say you're Christian and which represents Christ and do these kind of things? Another video documentary is Porter Speaksman's documentary, With God on Our Side. Very good. I've already showed you Allison Weir's book, Against Our Better Judgment. And, I definitely have about another 9 feet of books. But the issue is, I got here, it's that dispensationalism. So we get this yeah, right here. Dispensationalism is what the theology is that's behind that. But the way it gets worked out, and this is, Ilan Pape has some excellent material out. This is what's happening in the name of Christ. And I go, no way. This is not me. I'm not going to stand before the Lord on Judgment Day and say, I supported this. I supported these murders in the name of Christ. And then if you really want a thick book, look at this one. This is more bigger than Gone with the Wind, but excellent book by Michael Hoffman, Judaism Discovered, to find out what's really behind the teachings of Judaism. Is Talmudic Judaism, which is not in any way back to the Hebraic, the teachings of the Old Testament, and up till 70 AD, that was the end of the Hebraic teaching, that with the animal sacrifices, the temple, the priest, all that was destroyed in 70 AD. And so what we have after that is Talmudic Judaism, and that is not any way, shape, or form what the Old Testament was. And Jesus took the remnant from the Hebraics at that in through the his death, burial, and resurrection, his the church being formed in Acts chapter 2, going forth. The first 100 years were basically all Jewish believers who saw that what they were being indoctrinated with was not God's will, and they realized that Jesus was the Messiah, and out of that comes the church and so forth. Anyway, Chuck, that's just my little thing on the video. Go ahead and ask any questions if you want to about that. But I was really happy to see that at least this critique of Christian Zionism was getting such a lot of airtime.
Okay, thank you, Greg. And I have a few questions to get you started here. Explaining some facts. How do you feel about this film and explaining the story and explaining the facts of the Middle East? My reading of it was that the very bare facts were exposed. In other words, it did show that the Palestinian land was taken one hunk at a time, that it started in 1944 and 1946, that they were systematically squeezed, and it did show maps that showed the progression of Israel acquiring the Palestinian land. It, however, treated this all in a sort of a passive way.
Yes, it did.
Didn't blame anybody. In other words,
not at all.
Didn't come out and say this is a case of Israel stealing the land from these people. They simply treated it passively, and obviously this is done that way because they didn't want to offend certain people.
Exactly.
Would you say?
Yes.
Would you respond to that in your own way? I'd like to hear what you think.
Yeah. I saw that too, Chuck, because it just said about the British mandate and how the British decided that this was going to be a homeland for the Jews that had been persecuted in Europe. Well, who gave the Brits the right to do that? Where did that come? Where's that right? Is the only right I see is might makes right. That's the Brits had the might to go in there and do this, and so that makes it right because they have the might. Just the same thing in '67 when Israel took more of the land that actually was already set aside for Palestinians from the separation in 1948 with the UN partition. So the whole thing, I agree completely, Chuck, is that it did not put a dispersion towards the Jews coming in and stealing land. That was not anywhere, shape, or form in that. And that's when I said earlier about how Christian Zionism predates Herzl's in the Jewish Zionism. So you actually have Christian Zionism trying to get the Jews back to Palestine. And again, that came out of this premillennial dispensational thing. So that's the theological base that has ramifications through the political age that we are in today.
Okay. Now, another thought is it was stated here that the general idea of Christians, that the reason the Christians supported the Israeli position was that they believe that Jesus is going to come back literally to the state of Israel, and after a thing called the rapture, he's then going to appear in what is sometimes referred to as the second coming. Now, I thought the second coming was 70 AD when Jesus arose. And I always thought we had a second coming if we accepted Jesus. But this sort of suggested that the whole Christian movement was wrapped around the idea of this belief that I just stated. Did you get that feeling from reading the article? And if so, what's your response to that?
Yeah, it doesn't go back to where this whole idea of the rapture and the tribulation, all that stuff, it came from. Again, we go back to John Nelson Darby, in all the Schofield reference Bible and all that. That's where you have to go to find, because this ideas just don't come out of thin air. It's something they came from somewhere, and you just again follow the thread, keep pulling it back, and that's where it'll lead you back to these people. I found it very interesting when Sarah Posner is telling us that evangelical Christians believe in a literal Bible, and as opposed to and how we look at the Bible differently than, say, the Catholics or so forth. And I go, well, that's interesting. So if you would go to a Catholic and you say, do you believe in a literal Bible? Well, what else is it? Is it a fairy tale? I mean, if was Jesus alive literally or not? Did he die on the cross literally or not? I mean, any Christian that is a Christian would have to believe in a literal Jesus. Otherwise, you don't have a faith. You just have a wishful thinking in some fairy tale. So I thought that was really strange that they would use that word literally, because you could go to a Christian Zionist and say, well, do you believe the Bible literally? Well, yes, I do. Well, Jesus says, if your hand sins, cut your hand off. Well, are you going to do that literally? Well, no. But Jesus is coming back on a white horse with a sword on his side. Oh, well, that's literal. Come on. So it's the interpretation is everything, and the interpretation again is not what these people are coming up with on their own. It's what was taught to them through the Schofield, Darby, and all that stuff back then.
Yeah, and so in effect, the story we read, as I read it, might have appealed to a certain group of Christians that we have referred to as Christian Zionists, but the notion of Jesus' return in Palestine, physical Palestine after a thing called the rapture, would not be part of Catholic belief, I don't believe.
No.
Nor would it be the mainline Christian belief that the Lutherans, Presbyterians, Methodists would believe. Am I wrong about that?
No. It's which basically all Christians up until the premillennial dispensationalists, they believe that Jesus, that's the blessed hope. Jesus is going to come back for his own, and that's it. It's the end of this world as we know it, where there's going to be a new heaven and a new earth. We're going to be taken with Christ into his celestial kingdom, wherever and however that may be. That's always been the historical teaching, that Jesus is coming back. In fact, in the first century, Paul is talking about, don't be misled that Jesus hasn't come back yet. Like, people apparently were saying, oh, he's come back in secret. Well, this is what this rapture thing is, a secret coming back. Somehow Jesus shows up, doesn't quite come all the way to the earth, but he comes close to the earth. All the Christians get sucked off, and the pilots get taken out of their seats in the airplanes. The planes are crashing, and cars are crashing, and all this as the Christians get sucked up into the cosmos. I mean, that it sells a lot of books and movies, but it's not Bible. So anyway, I would say let's look at the historic church and base our theology what the early fathers and the church believed and what the Bible actually teaches.
Okay, so again, this gives one the impression that the people that wrote the article for VOX did not have a very broad understanding of what Christians believe.
No.
Because 2/3 of the Christians on the face of the earth would deny the whole notion of this of Jesus' physical return to Israel someday.
Right.
And the implication that the Jews in Israel are going to be saved people because God saved them thousands of years ago. Is that? Yeah. Going on with this thought, did you read the rest of the magazine, the Vox magazine? And I'm sure you looked at it at least and scanned it. Did you find anything else in it that supported this position of the Palestinians being crushed by the Israelis?
No, frankly, Chuck, I didn't read the magazine. I just watched the video and the comments of that. So I haven't perused the magazine part of it.
Well, I kind of looked through it, and I found really nothing else that treated this. And from that, I got the position that Vox, and also the careful way that they expressed who was at fault, who were the aggressors were, who were the people killing and who were the people being killed. They just never came out and placed the blame on Israel. They implied that it was a battle. The Palestinians were indeed losing their land systematically.
Mm-hmm.
And then they just suggested that there was war between them. But
Right.
I did not see the kind of thing there that would lead one to believe or understand that the Palestinians were victimized in the
Right.
struggle. Did you find that?
Well, that was clear in the video, because it talks about the Jewish people going back to their ancestral homeland, and that's we talked about, I think, last week on our podcast video here, that there's no way that any of these people that call themselves Jews can trace their lineage back to Abraham. They follow a religion of Judaism. I'll give them that, and that goes way back. But they as far as ethnically being connected to the land, I think that's just I think that is a fairy tale.
Yes. Well, we're going to go ahead tonight. If you have anything further,
No.
Now and then, we'll go ahead tonight and talk about a couple of other organizations, several organizations that claim to be involved in the Middle East, and that we can inform our listeners about and give them some idea about. And of course, my conclusion is that I wouldn't necessarily encourage anyone to spend their money buying Vox based upon the one story that I read or watched, and the absence of other writings by them that seem to support the position of Palestinians' rights in Palestine. If one was neutral about the whole thing and didn't care what's happening in the Middle East or in any of the so-called war zones, which are really killing zones, if you didn't really care, it wouldn't matter. But if one has an interest in a concern about ending the brutality of war killing and occupation, there might be better places to look than VOX magazine. I'd like to suggest that we take just a few minutes and talk about some of the other publications that might be doing something along the lines of Vox that our listeners might want to look at and listen to. Craig, feel free to interject as I go along, because I'm gonna read a little about one other organization that I've come upon that I'm very impressed with, and we don't have any interest in it. We don't own part of it. We don't know them personally, but I'd like to tell our readers a little bit about Telos, Telos. Telos Group Org is where you find it on the internet. Telos Group ORG. We came upon Telos through one of our volunteers who brought it to me and told me that it looked interesting, and it looked like some people that were working for justice in the Middle East. I noticed that it was heavily, and that they had noticed the heavy persecution by very powerful American Jewish powers who supported the activities of the State of Israel versus the Palestinian people. One of these critic groups that has vehemently criticized Telos is called Israel My Glory. And the website is Israel Glory, GLORY.org. You can look it up, Israel My Glory. Now, it's often said, and I believe this, it's usually correct. If you don't trust the media, which media can you trust? Can you tell a man by his enemies? Is a way of putting it. We found out that telos was started by two American citizens, one a California lawyer named Gregory Kalos, and he had an Arab name because he had Arab blood, but he was born in the United States and was a practicing attorney before he and a colleague started telos. Israel My Glory is one of the powerful organizations that is enormously critical of telos. Another sworn enemy is called CAMARA, C-A-M-A-R-A. And this stands for the Committee for the Accuracy in Middle East Reporting in America, CAMARA. And it calls telos, quote, a group that gives Palestinian leaders access to influential individuals in evangelical communities that they would not otherwise have. These influentials then lend their credibility to the anti-Zionist cause. So what he's saying here is that telos is busy trying to to persuade church members that they have an obligation to stop the bloodshed in Palestine. This is what it involves. It involves the idea that as a Christian following Christ, thou shalt be a peacemaker and love your brother as yourself. You have an obligation to all men to try to stop the cruelty and brutality that's going on right in front of you and in your name. We all need to realize that the brutality in Israel-Palestine is largely caused by the American aid to the state of Israel. The armaments that Israel uses to bomb Gaza every day or every week is American armaments that is given to them free, with virtually no cost to them at all. And so this is not a matter of watching some far off war game. Let's say it was in provinces in Russia or provinces in China. We're talking about something that's going on in a state that we basically fund and finance. We hold these truths knows that Christian Zionist movement is much different from the so-called evangelical movement that is referred to by these enemies of telos. The evangelical movement is, of course, can be anything. Anybody that believes in evangelizing their neighbor in the cause of Christ could be called an evangelical. However, Christian Zionism is drastically different definition from evangelicalism, and it can be a part of any group that sees themselves as recruiting non-Christians. I'm speaking here of evangelicals or anybody who is willing to believe they should recruit non-Christians. An example would be evangelical Lutherans who have evangelic in their name. There's a beginning of the organization behind Palestinians as the Christians in some of these groups, these evangelical, so-called evangelical groups, are beginning to see the brutality of Israeli occupation, and they're beginning to count the dead Palestinians at long last. The death list of Palestinians has been kept remarkably secret from the American people. Now, one of the biggest thorns in the side of the anti-Palestinian, anti-telos organization is one George Soros. Soros is believed to be, and is, we're told, and it's not a secret, the largest contributor to telos. Who is George Soros? Well, he is, strangely enough, a Hungarian-born Jew. He's not only one of the largest supporters of telos group, but he is also known to fund some 20 other Palestinian or pro-Palestinian organizations. In other words, George Telos, probably a non-believing Jew, but certainly a Jew by lineage, is a big supporter of the movement against for the Palestinian people, and in direct contrast to what's going on in Israel. He is also largely, well, there's nothing unusual about, we say there's nothing unusual about secular Jews supporting the notions that we hold these truths follows. We have friends ourselves who do it, and we are associated with a number of Jewish people who are very busily trying to support the Palestinian people. So back to Palestinian organizations against Israel, we lift up these Jewish guys who see it that way, and who are attempting to stop the absolute slaughter and starvation, literal starvation, of the Palestinian people who are living there under a mighty sword and dying daily, not just from murder from American weapons, but also by virtue of a very obvious and deliberate starvation created by destroying the water supply and preventing the inflow of money into Palestine. One of the latest things, Craig, that we have witnessed is that President Trump, who was referred to in some of these other documentaries, has found a way to cut off all aid for the citizens of Gaza, who really are fenced in and have nothing to eat. They're not even allowed to fish. So to our listeners and audience, we like to point out that there are other organizations beside We Hold These Truths are siding with the Palestinians and want to end the warring of our leadership in Washington. And one of these, of course, is this Kalos, and we want to lift them up and suggest that our listeners get to know them better as well. And we think that they would benefit from that experience. Craig, do you have anything to add or any thoughts before we wrap up?
No, that's really good, Chuck.
And if I said Karos, I meant Telos Group.
Yeah, that's exactly.
telosgroup.org. And one of those that we have found that there's really no doubt about it. And as I said to begin with, you can usually tell a man by his enemies. If you look at who his enemies are and analyze them closely, it gives you a pretty good idea what the man's character is. And likewise, I think this is the case with this organization, Telos. And conversely, those who are against your enemies are not necessarily always your friends. This needs to be carefully looked at as we look at other organizations. And we're going to see more organizations joining the bandwagon and coming out and saying, oh, the Palestinian people deserve better treatment. They need a better kind of a agreement. We now have a peace plan for the Palestinian people that doesn't offer them anything. It takes away practically everything else, what little they have left. So we have that coming out of Washington. We're going to have all kinds of organizations popping up and pretending to be broad-minded, to be defending fair, and to take care of these Palestinian people in some way. And we're just going to have that happening. And we need to be aware of it, Greg. We need to, Craig, we need to think about it, and we need to be able to cope with the deception that we're going to see from not only the Israelis, the pro-Israeli organizations, the politicians in Washington who want to cover up for the murders they really have been directly responsible for by their funding and by their care and love and loving care for the state of Israel. But we're also going to see, as we succeed with our effort, as we and our friends go on to succeed, and we will, we're going to see more and more of this tolerance showing up from those that didn't used to be tolerant even of the Palestinians. Any closing thoughts? If not, go ahead.
Well, Chuck, I always
Wrap it
say, follow the money. That's the thing with all these Christian Zionist organizations. They keep getting more pressure on the politicians to get more aid to Israel, and then the aid goes to Israel, and then Israel buys jets for people like Jerry Falwell and others. They're buying influence, and it's just this continual cycle. So it's refreshing to find a group like Telos that is exposing what's actually happening to the Palestinians. And it's not just the Palestinians. I mean, there's a lot of persecuted people all over the world, but what our focus is the fact that the church, who's supposed to represent Jesus Christ, Prince of Peace, blessed are the peacemakers, he totally anti war. He says, my kingdom is not of this world. All of that's our focus against exposing the lie of Christian Zionism.
Thank you, Craig, and good night.
Good night.